This is the fourth pilot module in Nebraska's training for new staff members working in lead poisoning prevention. Here we will focus on lead-based paint and how the dust generated when paint deteriorates impacts children. We will also consider the effects of lead deposited in soil. Slides will automatically advance with each voiceover. If you wish to move more quickly, please right-click to advance to the next slide. Early in the module, you will see a link to a pretest. At the end, you will see a link to a post-test and evaluation. Please complete both before you exit this module. We will cover three major topics in this module. First, why lead was used in consumer products in the first place. Next, what are the definitions of lead-based paint, lead dust, and lead in soil hazards? And finally, what are some of the key questions to ask families about exposure to these hazards, as well as key messages for family education? This module is intended to help you educate families more effectively about their lead-based paint risks. In the next module, we will talk about exposures that are not associated with paint, but still can have serious consequences for children. Now take a minute to complete the pretest. When finished, return to the module. As you can see, lead sources can be found in both the house and in the neighborhood where a child lives. Exposure to lead can come from paint, soil, water, and the products brought into the home. Exposure can also come from industrial emissions and improper disposal of lead-contaminated waste. Take a minute to look at this graphic more closely. Let's talk more about why lead is found in so many products. As a heavy metal, lead has a number of properties that make it useful in household products. First, it helps to enhance or brighten colors, which makes it useful in paint, ceramic coatings, toys, and cosmetics. It is also flexible, which makes it useful in solder, the lead connections in stained glass, and as an additive to plastic coatings. If you ever wondered why you see warning on Christmas tree lights that the product is not consistent with California standards, it's because lead was added to the plastic that covers the wire. It is toxic to mold. It was added to exterior paints and interior glossy paints where it would resist mold and mildew in wet conditions, such as bathrooms, kitchens, and window trim. Because of this property, homes that were originally built for wealthier clients used lead-based paint. It was a sign of status and good housekeeping. But as these homes have changed hands and may have had less upkeep, the paint begins to break down into chips and dust that children can access. Lead's low melting point makes it useful in producing jewelry and amulets. You can sometimes recognize it as a component if the metal is dull gray color and easily bends. But the only reliable way to be sure is to have it tested. Because lead is corrosion resistant, it often is used in batteries and machinery. Because it absorbs vibration, it was used in gasoline and car brakes. A heavy metal means it is dense. This is why lead is good for X-ray protection. But if it was used in paint, it also means that any paint chips or dust created when it breaks down will fall to the surfaces below the paint, like floors and windowsills. When used in gasoline, it will deposit on the ground near areas where there was high car and truck traffic. If lead was mined, or if industries that use lead were in the neighborhood, such as refineries or smelters, the debris created can also contain lead. This can contaminate soil in the surrounding neighborhoods or the groundwater beneath the site. And finally, lead added to glass helps it refract light. That is why it is used in leaded crystal and stained glass. Many older homes may have had stained glass windows for decorative purposes. So let's talk specifically about lead-based paint risks. Much of Nebraska's housing was built before 1978. We saw in the first module that the federal government did not ban the use of lead in residential paint until 1978. As you can see, housing built before 1950 is distributed throughout the state. These are the properties that were most likely to use lead-based paint and therefore are now most at risk for poor maintenance. Use of lead in residential paint began to taper off in the 1960s. And, as the legend in the map shows, even the areas colored yellow can have as much as 40% of their housing stock built before 1980. This means that every county in Nebraska needs to address lead-based paint in housing. Let's be specific about what we mean by lead-based paint. Nebraska's definition is consistent with the federal definitions first set forth in the Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992. These amend sections 401 through 404 of the Toxic Substance Control Act. There are several important qualifiers to this definition. First, the definition is not a health-based standard, it is the amount allowable by weight. Second, the definition applies to residential and child-occupied facilities. This means that more lead can be found in paint used for other purposes, such as bridges and marine uses. When children come in contact with these other kinds of paint, they may be exposed to more lead than in residential paint. And finally, these definitions only apply to paints used in the United States. Other countries have different definitions of lead-based paint, and this paint may be used on products that come in from abroad, such as children's toys. Many people still think of peeling paint as a cosmetic problem, an eyesore. But if the peeling paint is lead-based, then it's an immediate threat to children's health. So how can families tell if a house has lead-based paint? The answer is they can't without a physical test through a laboratory using actual samples of paint chips, or through the on-site use of an X-ray fluorescence analyzer. But families may see that their home has peeling paint and want to know if it is dangerous. Since it may take some time before a formal environmental inspection occurs, what can you say in the meantime? First, you can help them by giving them clues on what to look for. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has free online training in doing visual assessments. As you can see in the photos, paint may peel, but it can also crack in the alligator pattern typically associated with lead-based paint. The link to the free HUD training is provided on this slide. It takes about 20 minutes to complete. Second, you can help them understand what is causing the paint to fail. The first cause is moisture. All painted surfaces damaged by moisture should be considered deteriorated, and families need to know to look for the source of the moisture. This could be leaks in the ceiling, poor seals around the doors, windows, and chimneys, or it can come from outside because of problems with the siding or poor soil drainage. Next, friction and impact cause paint to deteriorate. Most paint was not designed to resist continued abrasion or the dings that come from hard use. Windows and doors are key areas to look for friction and impact damage. The photo of the door and jamb show this. Finally, poor surface preparation. If multiple coats of paint are used and there's a problem with the paint sticking to the surface, the upper layers may peel and expose the lead-based paint. The photo of the wall shows that underlying moisture is causing the paint to blister. Over time, this will flake off and pose a risk to children. Even if you don't do a visual assessment of the home yourself, you can tell families to look for these problems. If they find them, they should let your program know so you can get an inspection done. They should also look for chipping and peeling paint outside the house, since paint chips may get into the soil where children may play. Earlier, we looked at the definition of lead-based paint. If the amount of lead in the paint exceeds EPA and Nebraska's definitions, it qualifies as lead-based paint. If that paint is in poor condition, such as chipping, peeling, or chalking, then it is a hazard. If it is in good condition, Even if it contains lead, it may not be a hazard to children. So how do hazards occur? When lead-based paint chips break down, they produce a very fine dust. If children ingest even very small amounts of this dust, they are at risk for lead poisoning. Parents need to know that this is dust they cannot see. This is not because they are not good housekeepers. EPA has set national standards for dangerous levels of lead in paint, dust, and soil. These Section 403 standards define what is and isn't a hazard. The hazard standards address the kinds of exposure with greatest risk. Because lead is a heavy metal, the dust falls directly on the horizontal surfaces beneath the deteriorated paint, such as floors, tables, porch floors, or the ground beneath windows. We have already talked about the risks of ingesting lead paint and dust in the earlier module. Although you may not be involved in the in-home environmental inspection, families may ask you what the results mean. One of the things they may ask is how to interpret the information on the hazards found in the home. Anything above the EPA standard is considered a hazard. The property owner must correct the hazards identified in the report, following lead-safe work practices if they are an owner-occupant, or by hiring a firm that uses these techniques if they are a landlord. In 2020, EPA began to lower the definition of what constitutes floor and windowsill lead dust hazards to be more protective of children's health. The state of Nebraska is in the process of updating its rules to be consistent with these standards. The photo on the bottom shows how dust samples are collected. Soil hazards are measured differently as parts per million of lead in soil samples. Bare soil in play areas poses the greatest risk because the lead in soil may be accessible when children play in these areas. But when lead-based paint flakes at the drip line of the house, like in the middle photo, it can also be a hazard because children may play there as well. Throughout the property, but especially near sidewalks and the street, the lead and gasoline could have been deposited in the soil. Anyone could bring this into the home on their shoes. Let's take a minute to apply your understanding of what constitutes lead hazards to children. This is an example of deteriorating exterior paint on a friction and impact surface. Paint chips will be a problem, but so will tracking in lead dust from the porch floor. Paint chips below the window are a problem. Notice how the chips are breaking down on the floor. You can expect floor dust hazards here. But also notice the condition of the sills and the paint on the walls. Windowsills with lead dust are a problem because young children will grab onto them when they are trying to stand or look out the window. The paint flaking off the wall is clearly a hazard, but if you look closely in the lower left corner, you can see grass. This means there could be a soil lead hazard at the drip line of the unit. Now let's talk more about what are important messages to convey to the family. The local health department's role starts by taking a thorough environmental history. There is a difference between taking a history and completing a full environmental investigation. Local programs are responsible for collecting environmental histories by phone if the child has an elevated blood level of 5 micrograms or greater. The environmental history assesses risk factors, possible sources of exposure, parent occupation and hobbies, eating habits, behaviors, and health and housing conditions. This can be done by anyone trained at the local level to administer it. Some of the recommended questions are seen here. Take a minute to read through them. The actual environmental investigations must be conducted by trained and certified investigators if a child has an elevated blood lead level or 10 or greater. They can start with blood lead levels of 5 or greater if there are multiple children in the home under age 6. You will need to help families understand their responsibilities for controlling lead hazards before the in-home environmental investigation occurs. Many of these steps are practical and easy to implement. The next slides show some simple messages to convey to the families. For example, families need to look carefully at the walls, windows, woodwork, doors, stairs, and porches to spot chipping and peeling paint. Until the family knows whether the paint contains lead, they should block access to those areas. This can be as simple as keeping a room closed, moving furniture to keep children away from the site, or taping plastic or cardboard over the deteriorating paint. Next, you can help train families on how to clean until the hazards can be more permanently addressed. Again, it is important that families know their children's EBLLs are not because they are poor housekeepers. It is because the dust created by old paint is so fine that they can't clean it using their regular practices. New practices may include, first, picking up paint chips using wet paper towels and disposing of them in the trash in sealed bags. Second, mopping floors often and using a wet paper towel with detergent to wipe down windowsills and other surfaces regularly. This reduces the amount of accessible lead dust. Wastewater from the cleanup should go in the toilet, not the sink. Third, using a vacuum with a high-efficiency particulate air or HEPA filter whenever possible, since sweeping with a dry broom only spreads dust around. Shaking rugs outside will only spread dust over the ground. There may be vacuum loaner programs through community groups such as Rebuilding Together. Fourth, regularly washing toys, pacifiers, and other items that could go into the mouth to reduce children's ingestion of lead. And finally, being sure that children wash their hands, especially after playing outside and before eating. This can help reduce the amount of lead they ingest, but it is not a substitute for fixing the problem. Since lead in soil can track into the house easily, other important messages are taking shoes off when entering the house, using floor mats inside and outside the front and back entrances to reduce track-in, covering bare soil in the yard with mulch, gravel, or grass to put a barrier between the lead and the child. And if the family gardens for food, encouraging them to have the soil tested for lead. If it is present, they may still be able to garden if they use raised beds filled with new soil. What about when it comes to actually addressing the hazard? Working lead safe is everyone's job. Federal and Nebraska law require that workers be professionally licensed by the state if they perform specific activities such as inspection, sampling, or permanently abating or removing lead-based paint. They are required to take specific courses and refreshers to keep their knowledge up to date. Under the Federal Renovation, Repair, and Painting Act, or RRP, anyone who disturbs paint in pre-1978 housing must also take courses to prove they are working in a lead-safe manner. This involves a lot of professions that you might not immediately think are working in the field of lead, such as electricians. And finally, if do-it-yourselfers, property maintenance staff, or others do the work, they need to follow lead-safe practices in order to protect themselves and the residents of the home. If the family of a child with an EBLL tells you that work is being done in their house, it is important that they understand that if the work is done improperly, it could create more hazards. The first thing they can do is find out if the work is being done by lead-certified professionals. Most professionals will advertise their certification. Since families can't see lead in dust and construction debris, they need to be sure workers take steps to protect them and the workers themselves from the dust. Some of this is common sense, such as keeping residents and pets out of the work area and using personal protective equipment, or making sure that to prevent dust from escaping the work area, such as using plastic sheeting and other barriers to entering a work area. Families also need to know why certain construction practices are good to use around lead and which are dangerous. For example, dampening the surface of the painted area before starting work is important. It keeps lead dust from spreading and makes cleanup easier. Equipment for sanding, cutting, or grinding needs to be attached to a vacuum with a HEPA filter. This type of filter prevents very fine particles from returning to the air. Very high temperature heat guns or burning paint create toxic fumes. As the gas cools, it condenses into very fine particles that are easy to inhale and hard to clean up. That's why these practices are prohibited. Finally, families need to know that cleaning up after working around lead-based paint is complicated. If work surfaces are not wiped and vacuumed thoroughly, they can leave behind lead dust. If you want families to fully understand how lead-safe work practices apply in their homes, the Connecticut Department of the Environment has a 20-minute video for do-it-yourselfers based on the recommendations from the RRP. This is intended for education. It is not a substitute for proper worker training. Click on the introduction if you wish to view the video now. The link is also in the references at the end of this module. Another set of messages concern take-home exposures. Family members may unintentionally bring lead dust into the home or cars on their clothes. Ways to prevent take-home occupational exposures include not letting children visit the work area, showering before leaving work or as soon as they get home, changing clothes and shoes before leaving work if possible, washing work clothes separately from the family's wash, changing in an area of the home inaccessible to children, and protecting the inside of the vehicle from contamination with a towel or blanket. Some hobbies, such as making bullets or sinkers, jewelry, pottery, or stained glass, expose families to lead. Encourage families, if possible, to use materials that don't contain lead, such as pottery glazes without lead and copper shot instead of lead in bullets. Families who have hobbies or assemble products in their home, like jewelry making, should perform that work in areas other than the kitchen and dining room. These areas are the most likely places for contamination. Finally, families that do work in their yards on products that might contain lead, such as car repair, should try to do this away from where children play. One last thing you can do to protect all the families in your community is to let them know that landlords and property owners are required to tell potential renters or purchasers if they know the property has lead-based paint. They must also provide this prospective renter or purchaser a copy of the EPA pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. This pamphlet talks about what are lead hazards and strategies to protect families from exposure. It is available in many different languages. Click on the link to see more. Sometimes the family hears that their child has an EBLL and wants to be proactive. What would you tell them if they tell you they want to repair the hazards on their own? There may be many messages you could give them, including those on temporary barriers, cleaning, and not unknowingly bringing lead into the home. But in general, it is not wise for family members to do the work on their own without formal training. The in-home environmental investigation will give more concrete messages on where the hazards are found and what to do about them. Once that happens, the family needs to find someone to do the job properly. Here are some documents you might want to review more closely. Take a minute to review the key messages in this module. We hope this module gives you some context for the important work local health departments undertake for lead poisoning prevention. Click on the link to complete the post-test and provide us feedback. Thank you.